Hello class, welcome to Sensor Network. Today we are going to look at the introduction of sensor networks. Okay, so when we talk about sensor network or wireless sensor network, um, it can be defined as a network of devices that can communicate information gathered from a monitored field through a wireless link. So, assuming that you have a field which you want to monitor what is actually going on over there. Let's say you want to monitor the pollution that is coming from a mining site in a particular country. What you do is you have to um, place sensors at the place of interest and um, connect to a gateway which will communicate the information through the internet to the user. So if you have the combination of all these sensors, then we say that we have sensor network because they are gathering information and they are able to communicate. So when you put these sensors together, they are able to work with each other to sense some of the physical phenomena, and then the information gathered is processed, um, and the irrelevant information is given to the user to access. So if you consider wireless sensor network, it consists of protocols, it has algorithms, and the algorithm is self-organizing. So it has a self-organizing capabilities. Okay, so now let's look at the difference between a transducer and a sensor. So the word sensor and transducer are both widely used in the description of measurement systems. So when we are measuring information, mostly we use sensors and transducers. So when we talk about the the former is popularly in US, whereas the other one is used in Europe. So the word sensor, it was derived from the word to perceive, and transducer means to lead across. So now let's look at the dictionary definition of what a sensor is. So according to the dictionary, a sensor is a device that detects a change in a physical stimulus and turns it into a signal which can be measured or recorded. And if we look at a transducer, it is a device that transfers power from one system to another in the same or in different form. So now let's look at sensor classifications. So in classifying sensors, it ranges from simple sensors to complex sensor. So one of the best way to look at sensor is to consider the properties of sensor, and such properties include its response to stimulus, its specification, physical phenomenon, conversion mechanism, the materials, and application field. So if you want to also select a sensor, it depends on a lot of factors, and those factors include availability. So availability of that particular sensor, the cost of the sensor, the power consumption, because power consumption is very important because sensors are very small devices, and mostly we place them at areas where we cannot go back to change their power source, meaning that if we don't consider its power consumption, it is going to drain out quickly, and at the end of the day, you might not be able to go and replace its power source, and it will become waste. It might not be able to achieve um, the reason why you place that sensor. And you also have to consider the environmental conditions. Okay, so now let's look at ad hoc network. What is ad hoc network? So when we talk about ad hoc networks, um, let's say that um, you are in a place where you are in need of communication. If you're able to put devices together in order for the device to communicate, at that point in time, you have formed an ad hoc network. So one characteristic with ad hoc network is that you don't need an existing infrastructure. So it does not depend on an existing infrastructure. Mostly ad hoc networks are being used by military people when they are in the battlefield. They are able to um, form an ad hoc network where they use for communication. So now what is the difference between a sensor network and an ad hoc network? So as I talked about the ad hoc network, you realize that ad hoc network, you don't need an existing infrastructure to form an ad hoc network, but sensor network will need an existing infrastructure. Now, wireless sensor network mainly uses broadcast communication. So in the sensor network, the sensors broadcast their information, and other sensors are able to know what exactly is going on with the other sensor, and information is communicated through the gateway to the user. But for the ad hoc network, it uses point-to-point communication. So unlike the ad hoc network, the wireless sensor networks are limited in terms of um, power and energy consumption, and also its computational capabilities. As I said earlier on, um, because of the nature and the work of the sensor network, power limitation is a big issue. And because of the size's computational capabilities, it's also an issue because most of those devices are not really intelligent to be able to do complex computations. But in ad hoc network, you have devices which are already intelligent and they're able to compete, compute. So when we consider sensor nodes may not have a global ID because of the large amount of overhead and the large number of sensors involved. But an ad hoc network, because we're using devices, those devices will have a global ID. So now these are the differences between a sensor network and an ad hoc network. So now let's look at the wireless sensor and network hardware components involved. So you remember we talked about wireless sensor networks, that they are equipped with sensing, limited computation, and wireless capabilities. So it, so if you consider a typical wireless sensor network, we have a sensing unit. So the sensing unit is responsible for gathering the data or the information, and the information is given to the microcontroller or the embedded, which has the embedded system OS and the memory. So it stores the information and processes the information and is given to the transceiver, and the transceiver is responsible for broadcasting the information to other nodes. So we have a power unit which also powers all these components. So the main thing is we have an environment and a sensor which is sensing that particular environment. So now let's look at some of the applications of wireless sensor network. So the first application we'll talk about is disaster relief applications. So in disaster relief applications, it can be used for forest fire detection. So let's say that you have a forest which is prone to wildfire. So what you can do is to place sensors in the forest to detect the presence of fire so that you can promptly respond and quench the fire to save that forest. So what happens is if you place the sensors inside that in the forest at different places, it will sense the temperature. When the temperature begins to go up, it will send information to um, the control the control unit or the user for them to know that no, something is happening somewhere, so we have to quickly attend to that particular problem. And we can also use it in industries, especially to check for accidents in chemical factories. And we can also use it in military application to detect movement of the troops. Now let's look at the environmental control application. So in the environmental control application, we can use it for pollution measurement monitoring. So we can use it to check for environmental pollution, water pollution, and any other form of pollution we want to monitor. It can also be used as a surveillance for underground water studying of erosion process. So now we can also apply the sensor network in intelligent buildings and structures. So we can use that to monitor the real-time humidity and other physical parameters of the building. We can also um, use the sensor network to monitor the stress level of a building. Uh, Also, we can use to determine the stress level of bridges and other large structures, especially in areas um, where earthquakes are very active. So we can use that to determine the stress level of the building. We can also use it to detect people in a collapsed building. So if a building collapses, we can use the sensor network. Let's say if you have an infrared camera, we can use it to determine the presence of lives in a particular building. So the next application is facility management. So in facility management, you can use it for keyless entry application. So mostly in hotels, you can see that um, when you go to the hotels, they will give you a card which you use to activate the entry of the door, or use it to enter into your room. So, or let's say you have badges. In most institutions, your badges gives you access to important places or important buildings in the institution. So the badges are embedded. There are sensors embedded in the badges, which has your information, and that will allow you entry access. So we can also use it for to scan for leakages in chemical plants, and we can also use it to detect intruders, or it can also be used for vehicle security systems. So the next application is machine surveillance and preventive maintenance. So uh, we can also study the vibration pattern of a machine in order uh, to perform maintenance on that particular machine. Example is the axle of a train. So sensor network also has application in precision agriculture. So in agri, we can apply sensor network. So you can place sensors in the farm to monitor the water level in the soil or the humidity content in the soil. We can also use it to apply fertilizer uh, in your farm. So you can have, because of sensor network, you can have a smart farm. We can also use it for pest controls. And in the livestock breeding, you can use it to control and check the health status of animals. So you can use it for checking the temperature and the step counting. So if there is any abnormalities it will raise an alarm for the owner to attend to those issues. The last the next application I'll talk about is for battlefield, that is for detecting, classification, and tracking. So if the military men or the soldiers, when they are in the battlefield, they use sensor network to know the location of each of the soldiers, to also track their enemies, and it also helps them to be able to classify or to distinguish between who is part of them and who is an enemy. And the last application I'll talk about is habitat monitoring. So for habitat monitoring, example I'll talk about is wildlife monitoring. So example is when you consider the National Geography, they place sensors in the forest, they place sensors on the animals to know the movement of the animals, to know their lifestyle, to to know how they breed, and all the processes that the animals go through. So that is how come we are able to um, know and understand what goes on in the animal kingdom. So thank you very much for watching. Please post all your comments at the comment section, and see you in the next class.